Dean Martin and Marlon Brando's heated restaurant argument shocked everyone. What happened next revealed the truth about both Hollywood legends and proved that sometimes the most unexpected confrontations lead to the most profound understanding between two very different kinds of artists. It was November 8, 1962, and Romanoff's restaurant on Rodeo Drive was buzzing with its usual mix of Hollywood elite, industry executives, and wealthy tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of fame. The legendary Beverly Hills establishment had been the unofficial dining room of the movie business since 1941, where deals were made over martinis and careers were built or destroyed between the appetizer and the main course. Dean Martin sat at his regular corner table, the one Mike Romanoff always reserved for his most valued customers. Dean was there with his usual Thursday night dinner companions, his longtime friend and manager Herman Citron, and screenwriter Hal Kanter, who had worked with Dean on several recent film projects. It was supposed to be a relaxed evening, a chance to unwind after a busy week of recording sessions and script meetings. Dean was 55 years old and at the height of his popularity. His casual, effortless style had made him one of America's most beloved entertainers, and his success with the Rat Pack had turned him into a genuine cultural icon. But tonight, he was just Dino from Steubenville, Ohio, enjoying a good meal with old friends. The conversation was light, comfortable, the kind of easy banter that comes from years of friendship and mutual respect. They were discussing Dean's upcoming film schedule when the atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly shifted in a way that everyone could feel, but nobody could quite define. Marlon Brando had walked in. At 38, Brando was already considered one of the greatest actors of his generation, perhaps of any generation. His performances in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Wild One had revolutionized American acting, bringing a raw emotional intensity and psychological realism that had never been seen before on screen. But Brando was also known for something else: his contempt for the Hollywood establishment, his disdain for what he considered the shallow commercial side of the movie business. He rarely attended industry events, seldom socialized with other stars, and had made it clear in numerous interviews that he considered most of his fellow actors to be superficial entertainers rather than serious artists. Brando was shown to a table across the dining room, accompanied by his acting coach, Stella Adler, and two other people from the New York theater world. As he settled into his seat, his eyes swept across the restaurant and landed on Dean Martin's table. For a moment, the two men looked directly at each other across the crowded room. Dean nodded politely, the kind of professional acknowledgement that one successful performer gives to another. Brando's response was barely perceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes that could have been recognition or could have been something else entirely. Dean turned back to his conversation, but something had changed in the restaurant's atmosphere. Other diners were stealing glances between the two tables, sensing some kind of tension that hadn't been there moments before. 20 minutes later, as Dean was finishing his veal piccata and discussing the possibility of doing a dramatic role for a change, Marlon Brando stood up from his table and walked directly toward them. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths, and even the waiters slowed their movements to see what was about to unfold. Brando stopped beside Dean's table, his presence immediately dominating the space around them. He was dressed in his typical casual style: dark slacks, a white shirt open at the collar, and a black leather jacket that had become part of his signature look. "Martin," Brando said, his voice carrying that distinctive mixture of intensity and barely controlled emotion that had made him famous. Dean looked up calmly, setting down his fork and giving Brando his full attention. "Brando, how are you?" "I'm fine," Brando replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't a social visit. "I was just sitting over there, listening to my colleagues discuss the current state of American cinema, and your name came up." Herman Citron and Hal Kanter exchanged glances, sensing trouble brewing. Dean remained perfectly calm, his expression pleasant but alert. "Oh? In what context?" Brando's jaw tightened slightly. "In the context of what's wrong with this business, in the context of how genuine artistry gets buried under superficial charm and mass-market appeal." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette. Dean's dinner companions looked uncomfortable, But Dean himself seemed completely unfazed. "That's interesting," Dean said, his voice maintaining its characteristic warmth. "Would you like to elaborate on that? You want me to elaborate?" Brando's voice rose just enough to carry to the nearby tables, and several other diners turned to watch openly. "You represent everything that's shallow about Hollywood. You cruise through performances on charm and likability instead of doing the real work of creating authentic characters. You're a personality, not an actor." The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. This wasn't just a disagreement between two celebrities. This was a philosophical battle between two completely different approaches to entertainment and art. Dean took a sip of his wine, considering his response carefully. When he spoke, his voice remained calm and measured. "You know, Marlon, I've heard this criticism before. From critics, from other actors, from people who think there's only one way to approach this business. But let me ask you something. Who decided that suffering equals authenticity?" Brando's eyes flashed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that your whole approach seems to be based on the idea that unless you're tortured and intense and digging deep into psychological trauma, you're not really acting. But that's just one way to connect with an audience." Dean leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed despite the tension crackling around them. "I grew up poor in Ohio. I've worked every kind of job you can imagine. I've seen real suffering, real struggle, real life. And you know what I learned? People don't need more pain in their lives. They need moments of joy, of escape, of feeling like everything's going to be okay. If I can give them that for 2 hours in a movie theater or an hour in a nightclub, that's not shallow. That's necessary." Brando's expression shifted slightly, as if Dean's response wasn't what he had expected. "But that's exactly the problem," Brando countered, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "You're giving people what they want instead of what they need. Art should challenge people, should make them confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world." "Should it?" Dean asked. "Says who? And why can't art do both? Why can't entertainment also be meaningful?" Dean gestured toward the restaurant around them. "Look at this place. Look at these people. Most of them work incredibly hard at jobs that don't fulfill them. They deal with stress, with disappointment, with all the ordinary struggles of human existence. When they come to see me perform, or watch one of my movies, I'm not trying to add to their burden. I'm trying to give them a break from it." He paused, meeting Brando's intense gaze directly. "That doesn't mean I don't respect what you do. Your work is powerful, important, necessary. But so is mine. Different doesn't mean inferior." Brando was quiet for a moment, clearly not expecting this kind of thoughtful response from someone he had dismissed as a lightweight entertainer. "But don't you want to challenge yourself artistically?" Brando asked, and for the first time there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than confrontation. "Don't you want to explore the deeper possibilities of what acting can be?" Dean smiled, and it was the first completely natural expression he'd shown since the confrontation began. "Who says I don't? You think what I do is easy? You think it's simple to make a room full of strangers feel comfortable, to make them laugh, to make them forget their troubles? You think it's effortless to create a character that feels like someone you'd want to have a drink with?" Dean leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've studied too, Marlon. Maybe not with your teachers, maybe not using your methods, but I've worked to understand what I do and how to do it better. The difference is, I don't think suffering is a requirement for authenticity." Stella Adler, who had been watching from across the room, approached the table. She was one of the most respected acting teachers in America, a woman whose opinion carried enormous weight in theatrical circles. "Excuse me for interrupting," she said, addressing both men, "but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation, and I think you're both missing something important." Both Dean and Marlon turned to her with interest and respect. "You're arguing about two different kinds of truth," she continued. "Marlon, you work from the inside out, finding the emotional reality of a character and building from there. Dean, you work from the outside in, creating a persona that connects with audiences and finding truth through that connection. Both approaches are valid. Both are necessary." She looked at Dean with genuine appreciation. "What you do, Mr. Martin, the way you create intimacy with an audience, The way you make people feel comfortable and welcomed. That's not a lesser form of art. That's a different form of mastery. Then she turned to Brando. And what you do, Marlon, the way you dig into the psychological depths of character, the way you reveal hidden truths about human nature, that's essential too. American cinema needs both of you. The tension that had been building in the restaurant began to dissipate. Other diners started returning to their own conversations, sensing that the confrontation had shifted into something more like a discussion. Brando looked at Dean with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time that there might be more depth to the man he had dismissed as a superficial entertainer. "I may have misjudged you," Brando said quietly. Dean's response was characteristically gracious. "We all make assumptions. I've probably made some about you too. Maybe we should have had this conversation years ago." "Maybe we should have," Brando agreed. Stella Adler smiled. "You know this conversation you've just had? This is exactly the kind of honest dialogue about craft that American actors need to be having more often." Dean gestured toward the empty chairs at his table. "Would you like to join us, all of you? I'd be interested in hearing more about your approach to character development." Brando hesitated for a moment, then sat down. "I'd like that. And I'd like to understand better how you create that sense of effortless connection with audiences." What followed was one of the most fascinating conversations about acting, entertainment, and the purpose of art that anyone in that restaurant had ever witnessed. Two men who had started the evening viewing each other as representing everything wrong with their profession ended it with a genuine appreciation for each other's craft and philosophy. By the time they parted ways 3 hours later, both men had gained something valuable: a broader understanding of what it meant to be a professional entertainer and artist in America. Years later, when interviewers asked Dean about his relationship with Marlon Brando, he would always speak with respect and warmth about "one of the most talented actors I've ever known, and a man who taught me that there's room for every kind of truth in this business." Brando, for his part, would later say in interviews that Dean Martin had shown him that connecting with audiences is its own kind of craft, and that bringing joy to people is just as important as challenging them. The confrontation that could have ended in mutual animosity instead became the beginning of an unlikely friendship between two men who represented very different aspects of American entertainment, but who discovered they shared a common commitment to excellence in their craft. If this story of unexpected understanding between two Hollywood legends moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that different approaches to the same goal can both be valid and valuable. Have you ever had a confrontation that ended in greater mutual respect? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the real relationships behind Hollywood's biggest names.